Hello, my name is SCOUCH and I am a licensed Virginia educator. I hold a Bachelor of Science in the Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences from Old Dominion University. And I left teaching to pursue a career using my background in environmental science and the sciences in general in the manufacturing industry. So, thank you for coming. One of the issues that we're going to talk about that this podcast is intended to bring awareness on, it's really highlighting the importance of environmental stewardship and occupational safety for people in the workforce, for children in our schools, and for just general society and industry. So today I do work in the manufacturing industry. I am pursuing my Master's of Education in Administration and Supervision from Liberty University. And I am doing that because a lot of those skills from formal education, experience with the government, school law, those organizational basic compliance skills translate to the manufacturing industry, which is something that I do every day. I see a lot more of environmental regulations being put into place in the manufacturing industry. I think there's a need for it to be oversight for it on a daily basis rather than in the school system where we just talked about the issues and educated our youth and tried to inspire them to be environmental stewards for the good of the society that they're going to live in. So these regulations for protecting the environment and the safety of humans and their health are both applied to government, example, public schools and private industry. Both of these sectors must abide by these regulations for the safety of humans and the environment alike. Many people find regulations to be kind of a nuisance and unnecessary, or like they're treading maybe on their rights. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes these efforts and these regulations are not used, or maybe they didn't have the adequate research. But the one I want to talk about today is asbestos, and that one is widely known for decades to be a huge concern for the safety of humans and their health and the environment. So I just want to we're going to talk about the history of the EPA's regulations on asbestos exposure, and the importance, hopefully, will be solidified for the listeners of being an environmental steward for those reasons. Responsible stewardship and the responsible use and abatement of asbestos in the workplace and schools is critical for the health and safety of the people who frequent these areas. So let's just go ahead and start talking about a brief history of asbestos. It's been used as early as the 1920s. It's been around for centuries. In 1971, the EPA identified asbestos as a hazardous air pollutant. And this is all on the EPA website. All the regulations are posted there. 2 years later, in 1973, the EPA issued the Asbestos National Emission Standards for hazardous air pollutants. So we were starting, as a society, to start putting regulations on this potential natural mineral that was great for industry and infrastructure and building materials that has, over time, with support and peer-reviewed articles and evidences, right, to be a huge danger to the health of humans. Okay, so during the 1971 and 1973 efforts that the EPA spearheaded with regards to regulations regarding asbestos use, they banned the use of asbestos in several applications that included spray-applied surface materials for fireproofing and insulation, asbestos pipe insulation, asbestos block insulation, artificial fireplace embers, and wall patching compounds. The EPA, after this, issued a final rule to ban most asbestos-containing products in 1989. Again, this didn't take care of everything. So in 2019, the EPA came back to asbestos and issued an additional final rule that prohibits the reintroduction of discontinued asbestos products without the EPA's evaluation. So it was still trying to be used in the industry. They banned chrysotile asbestos. And then just this year, decades later, centuries later, in March of 2024, the EPA put out its most recent and final ruling of asbestos from the Biden administration, who banned chrysotile asbestos in the United States completely. Their actions were motivated by research into asbestos-related diseases, which began as far back as the 1920s and the 1930s. Medical discoveries by Dr. Irving J. Selikoff, which linked asbestos to diseases like lung cancer and mesothelioma. And then, of course, there was the consumer demand for asbestos-free products because by 2024 we have seen the impact. So I am talking about this important issue as just one of the things to highlight the purpose of the EPA, and we'll talk about other organizations like OSHA that support the EPA and its efforts regarding asbestos, but also on multiple other issues. So the reason I chose this to talk to you about today is because, one, I work in the manufacturing industry, of course, so safety is huge. We are highly regulated in that regard. However, of course, process improvement is always something that is desired and will always need to be needed. So also, as part of the curriculum that the Virginia Department of Education put out when I was teaching, was environmental science, and it talked about the EPA and its regulations and the purpose of that organization, that group. So this is right in my wheelhouse on what I taught, and I have a personal story that goes along with why it's important to have certain regulations if they are founded in merit with peer-reviewed research and scholarly articles, right? In fact, and not an abuse of power. So, my grandmother, we'll start with her. She worked in a local factory here in Virginia. I'm not going to say the name because this happened in the 1970s, and as you can see, regulations have continued to change. The last one was just put out this year in March from the EPA, 2024. My grandmother worked in a factory, and there was asbestos there. It was in the 1970s. The EPA had just started tackling the issues of asbestos. It just became new knowledge that it was a health issue. So she worked in a factory where they were performing asbestos abatement. And of course, the newness of it, process improvement had its time to take its toll. So while she was working at a brazing table with other coworkers, men in protective suits were cleaning and removing the asbestos above them. She said the factory management did not shut down during this time. Workers at the time did not realize the danger. Again, this was fairly new at the time. It was in the 1970s, and the first EPA action was in 1971. So as they were working, friable asbestos was falling around them, and she described it as like snow. This was well over 40 years ago, right? So it was just until about 3 years ago that the microscopic fibers that my grandmother and her coworkers inhaled began causing the onset of an aggressive mesothelioma in my grandmother. She did win a lawsuit, but she died quickly in just 4 weeks when it was no longer able to be controlled. It was a terminal illness. So I will just give a shameless plug to my grandma. This podcast is in your honor to keep the awareness abreast and in the forefront of the minds of our society, as she just passed away this past Sunday on the 24th of November in 2024. The good thing is that it is widely known today that exposure to friable asbestos is a severe health concern. However, Its complete eradication in some places could be argued. As you can tell, there had been some back and forth from my brief history of review of industry wanting to bring asbestos back, and the EPA passing regulations. Again, their most recent regulation just came out in March of this year. So on the 28th of March this year, in 2024, the EPA finalized a rule to prohibit the manufacture, including import, processing, distribution and commerce, and commercial use and disposal of chrysotile asbestos to prevent unreasonable risk of injury to health. And this is in accordance with the TSCA Section 6A 15 USC 2605A. Years ago, asbestos was used routinely for various infrastructure and construction, which consisted of friable asbestos that broke apart and would be inhaled or ingested by the people in the area in which it was degrading, whether that be human abatement or natural deterioration, whatever the reason. According to the mesotheliomagroup.com, exposure to asbestos is the primary cause of mesothelioma, which is what my poor grandmother passed away from on Sunday, and she was courageous. She was wonderful. Inhaling or ingesting asbestos causes these microscopic fibers that make up friable asbestos to get lodged in the lining of that person's chest or abdomen, and over time the fibers can cause tumor development because the body is incapable of expelling the fibers. So your body's constantly trying to expel them, but they're lodged in there and they cannot get out. Asbestos sounds terrible, but so how do we discover it? It's actually a naturally occurring mineral used for centuries in products ranging from textiles to insulation. Asbestos usage really increased throughout the world in the first half of the 20th century, and it peaked in the United States during the 1970s, right when my grandmother was exposed. Asbestos continued to be used in a wide variety of industries in the 1980s and even later. To date, roughly 30 million tons have been used in the United States alone. And there are several ways people are exposed to asbestos. It could be occupational. Some people were directly exposed to asbestos at their jobs, or from performing tasks such as home or car repairs. Asbestos were widely used in construction and industrial trades, and this is called first-hand exposure. There's second-hand exposure, where people were exposed to asbestos found on the clothes, skin, or hair of someone working with or near the mineral. That's second-hand exposure, and one of the other ways people are exposed. And of course, there's environmental. As a mineral, asbestos can be found in nature. It's natural. And traditionally, asbestos mines that operated in the past released fibers into the air. So if you were in the vicinity of that, you would have been at risk. Asbestos is made up of flexible microscopic fibers, and as stated before, once they're ingested or inhaled, they get stuck in the outermost lining of your insides, and your body cannot expel it, which causes a cellular reaction in very aggressive tumors in some cases. The reason they chose asbestos is because it's highly resistant to heat, water, and corrosive damage, and these properties made it the ideal material for a variety of applications. So I think there was good intentions there, but I used to coin this as building the Titanic without the lifeboats. You have two main categories of asbestos, serpentine and amphibole. Serpentine has wavy fibers, and they're found in approximately 95% of commercially developed asbestos products in the United States. Amphibole, these are spindle-shaped fibers that are sharp, rigid, and more capable of lodging themselves in body tissue. These type of fibers are the ones that are commonly contributed to the risk of developing mesothelioma, which is what my grandmother passed away from on Sunday. Asbestos itself is not an automatic threat. Before it can do damage to your body, the asbestos must be inhaled or ingested. So organizations such as the EPA do not acknowledge any safe level of asbestos exposure now, but in the past they did not always do that. Asbestos is categorized as a carcinogen by both the U.S. Department of Health and Services, the EPA, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Generally speaking, asbestos will enter the body through inhalation or ingestion, one of those two routes, and roughly 2/3 of the fibers are breathed out from the body, Some fibers remain, and those will become lodged in the lining of the lungs, which is called the pleura, or the abdominal cavity, or the heart, pericardium. Over time, the tiny fibers cause scarring, inflammation, and genetic changes that develop into mesothelioma. Regardless of how asbestos fibers cause mesothelioma, symptoms do not usually present themselves until roughly 10 to 60 years even after the initial exposure. Most of the time, mesothelioma symptoms are often mistaken for those of other ailments. So it's a very sneaky disease, and it's a grave danger to human health. So how this applies to our schools. A lot of our schools, especially in my county, are older. Part of the 2024 effort in pursuant to the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, the asbestos-containing materials in schools requires local education agencies to inspect their school buildings for asbestos-containing building material, prepare asbestos management plans, and perform asbestos response actions to prevent or reduce asbestos hazards. Public school districts and nonprofit private schools, including charter schools and schools affiliated with religious institutions, are subject to the rules requirements as well. In support of the EPA, OSHA, which is commonly known, very widely known in the manufacturing industry, occupational safety, health and hazards, its standard number 1910.1001 is currently the primary organization to enforce safe asbestos exposure with the support of the EPA's regulation. So we do have multiple organizations working together. But for the following operations, wherever feasible, engineering controls and work practices that can be instituted that are not sufficient to reduce employee exposure to or below the TWA and or excursion limit listed in that standard, the employer is required to reduce employee exposure to or below 0.5 fibers per cubic centimeter of air. It's an 8-hour time-weighted average. And they shall supplement them by the use of any combination of respiratory protection, such as respirators, that complies with requirements of that standard as well. Work practices and feasible engineering controls that will reduce employee exposure are critical. Of course, in safety, we always try to eliminate the hazard, and if you can't, then you're looking at administrative controls, engineering controls. The very last line of defense is your PPE. However, total asbestos abatement is the best preventative measure for protecting human health. So that's just some awareness on asbestos, some of the good the EPA and the OSHA organizations have done for society, and why it's important to have that mindset of environmental stewardship. So one we can do as environmental stewards, if we aren't able to go out with OSHA and ensure every industry, every factory, every school has abated their asbestos, is we can make awareness just by doing something like this podcast. We can push for policy change. These are all characteristics of a good environmental steward, and because of those very items, after decades, the EPA has enacted a full asbestos ban. So in that way, I feel like my grandmother's story was a part of that contribution to protect the health and safety of those that came after her. So I want to leave my listeners with these thoughts. Have you had asbestos or know someone who has had asbestos exposure? Where would we be without the EPA's and OSHA's regulations on asbestos exposure, and how could they improve? And have we achieved a state of safety in current day in regarding asbestos? Is its responsible use being applied everywhere?